Chapter 10. Take 2 elements, call me in the morning. Copper, vanadium, gadolinium, silver, sulfur, rhodium. The periodic table is a mercurial thing, and most elements are more complicated than the straightforward rogues of Poisoner's Corridor. Obscure elements do obscure things inside the body, often bad, but sometimes good. An element toxic in one circumstance can become a life-saving drug in another, and elements that get metabolized in unexpected ways can provide new diagnostic tools in doctors' clinics. The interplay of elements and drugs can even illuminate how life itself emerges from the unconscious chemical slag of the periodic table. The reputations of a few elemental medicines extend back a surprisingly long time. Roman officers supposedly enjoyed better health than their grunts because they took their meals on silver platters. And however useless hard currency was in the wild, most pioneer families in early America invested in at least one good silver coin, which spent its Conestoga wagon ride across the wilderness hidden in a milk jug, not for safekeeping, but to keep the milk from spoiling. The noted gentleman astronomer Tycho Brahe, who lost the bridge of his nose in a drunken sword duel in a dimly lit banquet hall in 1564, was even said to have ordered a replacement nose of silver. The metal was fashionable and, more important, curtailed infections. The only drawback was that its obviously metallic color forced Brahe to carry jars of foundation with him, which he was always smoothing over his nasal prosthesis. Curious archaeologists later dug up Brahe's body and found a green crust on the front of his skull, meaning Brahe had probably worn not a silver, but a cheaper, lighter, copper nose. Or perhaps he switched noses like earrings, depending on the status of his company. Author's note: in addition to studying the crust around Brahe's fake nose, the archaeologists who dug him up also found signs of mercury poisoning in his mustache, probably a result of his active research into alchemy. The usual story of Brahe's demise is that he died of a ruptured bladder. One night at a dinner party with some minor royalty, Brahe drank too much, but he refused to get up and go to the bathroom because he thought leaving the table before his social superiors did would be rude. By the time he got home, hours later, he couldn't pee anymore, and he died 11 excruciating days later. The story has become a legend, but it's possible that mercury poisoning contributed as much or more to the astronomer's death. Either way, copper or silver, the story makes sense. Though both were long dismissed as folk remedies, modern science confirms that those elements have antiseptic powers. Silver is too dear for everyday use, but copper ducts and tubing are standard in the guts of buildings now, as public safety measures. Copper's career in public health began just after America's bicentennial in 1976, when a plague broke out in a hotel in Philadelphia. Never-before-seen bacteria crept into the moist ducts of the building's air conditioning system that July, proliferated, and coasted through the vents on a bed of cool air. Within days, hundreds of people at the hotel came down with the flu, and 34 died. The hotel had rented out its convention center that week to a veterans group, the American Legion, and though not every victim belonged, the bug became known as Legionnaire's disease. The laws pushed through in reaction to the outbreak mandated cleaner air and water systems, and copper has proved the simplest, cheapest way to improve infrastructure. If certain bacteria, fungi, or algae inch across something made of copper, they absorb copper atoms, which disrupt their metabolism. Human cells are unaffected. The microbes choke and die after a few hours. This effect, the oligodynamic or self-sterilizing effect, makes metals more sterile than wood or plastic and explains why we have brass doorknobs and metal railings in public places. It also explains why most of the well-handled coins in the U.S. realm contain close to 90% copper, or, like pennies, are copper-coated. Copper tubing in air conditioning ducts cleans out the nasty bugs that fester inside there, too. Author's note: the elemental compositions of U.S. coins. New pennies, since 1982, are 97.5% zinc, but have a thin copper coating to sterilize the part you touch. Old pennies were 95% copper. Nickels are 75% copper, the balance nickel. Dimes, quarters, and half dollars are 91.67% copper, the balance nickel. Dollar coins, besides special-issue gold coins, are 88.5% copper, 6% zinc, 3.5% manganese, and 2% nickel. Similarly deadly to small wriggling cells, if a bit more quackish, is vanadium, element 23, which also has a curious side effect in males. Vanadium is the best spermicide ever devised. Most spermicides dissolve the fatty membrane that surrounds sperm cells, spilling their guts all over. Unfortunately, all cells have fatty membranes, so spermicides often irritate the lining of the vagina and make women susceptible to yeast infections. Not fun. Vanadium eschews any messy dissolving and simply cracks the crankshaft on the sperm's tails. The tails then snap off, leaving the sperm whirling like one-oared rowboats. Author's note: some further facts about vanadium. Some creatures, no one knows why, use vanadium in their blood instead of iron, which turns their blood red, apple green, or blue, depending on the creature. When sprinkled into steel, vanadium greatly strengthens the alloy without adding much weight, much like molybdenum and tungsten. See Chapter 5. In fact, Henry Ford once boomed, "Why, without vanadium there would be no automobiles." Vanadium hasn't appeared on the market as a spermicide because, and this is a truism throughout medicine, knowing that an element or a drug has desirable effects in test tubes is much different from knowing how to harness those effects and create a safe medicine that humans can consume. For all its potency, vanadium is still a dubious element for the body to metabolize. Among other things, it mysteriously raises and lowers blood glucose levels. That's why, despite its mild toxicity, vanadium water from, as some sites claim, the vanadium-rich springs of Mount Fuji is sold online as a cure for diabetes. Other elements have made the transition into effective medicines, like the hitherto useless gadolinium, a potential cancer assassin. Gadolinium's value springs from its abundance of unpaired electrons. Despite the willingness of electrons to bond with other atoms, within their own atoms they stay maximally far apart. Remember that electrons live in shells, and shells further break down into bunks called orbitals, each of which can accommodate 2 electrons. Curiously, electrons fill orbitals like patrons find seats on a bus. Each electron sits by itself in an orbital until another electron is absolutely forced to double up. Author's note: the bus metaphor for how electrons fill their shells one at a time until someone is absolutely forced to double up is one of the best in chemistry, both folksy and accurate. It originated with Wolfgang Pauli, who discovered the Pauli exclusion principle in 1925. When electrons do condescend to double up, they are picky. They always sit next to somebody with the opposite spin, a property related to an electron's magnetic field. Linking electrons, spin, and magnets may seem weird, but all spinning charged particles have permanent magnetic fields, like tiny Earths. When an electron buddies up with another electron with a contrary spin, their magnetic fields cancel out. Gadolinium, which sits in the middle of the rare Earth row, has the maximum number of electrons sitting by themselves. Having so many unpaired, non-canceling electrons allows gadolinium to be magnetized more strongly than any other element, a nice feature for magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. MRI machines work by slightly magnetizing body tissue with powerful magnets and then flipping the magnets off. When the field releases, the tissue relaxes, reorients itself randomly, and becomes invisible to a magnetic field. Highly magnetic bits like gadolinium take longer to relax, and the MRI machine picks up on that difference. So by affixing gadolinium to tumor-targeting agents, chemicals that seek out and bind only to tumors, doctors can pick tumors out on an MRI scan more easily. Gadolinium basically cranks up the contrast between tumors and normal flesh, and depending on the machine, the tumor will either stand out like a white island in a sea of grayish tissue or appear as an inky cloud in a bright white sky. Even better, gadolinium might do more than just diagnose tumors. It might also provide doctors with a way to kill those tumors with intense radiation. Gadolinium's array of unpaired electrons allow it to absorb scads of neutrons, which normal body tissue cannot absorb well. Absorbing neutrons turns gadolinium radioactive, and when it goes nuclear, it shreds the tissue around it. Normally, triggering a nano-nuke inside the body is bad. But if doctors can induce tumors to absorb gadolinium, it's sort of an enemy of an enemy thing. As a bonus, gadolinium also inhibits proteins that repair DNA, so the tumor cells cannot rebuild their tattered chromosomes. As anyone who has ever had cancer can attest, a focused gadolinium attack would be a tremendous improvement over chemotherapy and normal cancer radiation, both of which kill cancer cells by scorching everything around them, too. Whereas those techniques are more like firebombs, gadolinium could someday allow oncologists to make surgical strikes without surgery. Author's note: besides gadolinium, gold is often cited as the best hope for treating cancer. Gold absorbs infrared light that otherwise passes through the body and grows extremely warm as it does so. Delivering gold-coated particles into tumor cells could allow doctors to fry tumors without damaging the surrounding tissue. This method was invented by John Canzias, a businessman and radio technician who underwent 36 rounds of chemotherapy for leukemia beginning in 2003. He felt so nauseated and beaten up by the chemo, and was so filled with despair at the sight of the children with cancer he encountered in his hospital, that he decided there had to be a better way. In the middle of the night, he came up with the idea of heating metal particles, and he built a prototype machine using his wife's baking pans. He tested it by injecting half a hot dog with a solution of dissolved metals and placing it in a chamber of intense radio waves. The tampered-with side of the hot dog fried, while the other half remained cold. This is not to say that element 64 is a wonder drug. Atoms have a way of drifting inside the body, and like any element the body doesn't use regularly, gadolinium has side effects. It causes kidney problems in some patients who cannot flush it out of their systems, and others report that it causes their muscles to stiffen up like early stages of rigor mortis and their skin to harden like a hide, making breathing difficult in some cases. From the looks of it, there's a healthy internet industry of people claiming that gadolinium, usually taken for an MRI, has ruined their health. As a matter of fact, the internet is an interesting place to scout out general claims for obscure medicinal elements. With virtually every element that's not a toxic metal, and even occasionally with those, you can find some alternative medicine site selling it as a supplement. Author's note: in the May 2009 issue of Smithsonian, the article Honorable Mentions, Near Misses in the Genius Department, describes one Stan Lindbergh, a daringly experimental chemist who took it upon himself to consume every single element of the periodic table. The article notes, in addition to holding the North American record for mercury poisoning, his gonzo account of a 3-week ytterbium bender, Fear and Loathing in the Lanthanides, has become a minor classic. I spent a half-hour hungrily trying to track down Fear and Loathing in the Lanthanides before realizing I'd been had. The piece is pure fiction. Although, who knows? Elements are strange creatures, and ytterbium might very well get you high. Probably not coincidentally, you'll also find personal injury firms on the internet willing to sue somebody for exposure to nearly every element. So far, the health gurus seem to have spread their message farther and wider than the lawyers, and elemental medicines, e.g. the zinc in lozenges, continue to grow more popular, especially those that have roots in folk remedies. For a century, people gradually replaced folk remedies with prescription drugs. But declining confidence in Western medicine has led some people to self-administer drugs such as silver once more. Author's note: Wired magazine ran a short news story in 2003 about the online reemergence of silver health scams. The money quote, "Meanwhile, doctors across the country have seen a surge of argyria cases. In the last year and a half, I've seen 6 cases of silver poisoning from these so-called health supplements," said Bill Robertson, the medical director of the Seattle Poison Center. "They were the first cases I'd seen in 50 years of medical practice." Again, there is an ostensible scientific basis for using silver, since it has the same self-sterilizing effects as copper. The difference between silver and copper is that silver, if ingested, colors the skin blue. Permanently. And it's actually worse than that sounds. Calling silvered skin blue is easy shorthand, but there's the fun electric blue in people's imaginations when they hear this, and then there's the ghastly gray zombie Smurf blue people actually turn. Thankfully, this condition, called argyria, isn't fatal and causes no internal damage. A man in the early 1900s even made a living as the Blue Man in a freak show after overdosing on silver nitrate to cure his syphilis. It didn't work. In our own times, a survivalist and fierce libertarian from Montana, the doughty and doughy Stan Jones, ran for the U.S. Senate in 2002 and 2006, despite being startlingly blue. To his credit, Jones had as much fun with himself as the media did. When asked what he told children and adults who pointed at him on the street, he deadpanned, "I just tell them I'm practicing my Halloween costume." Jones also gladly explained how he contracted argyria. Having his ear to the tin can about conspiracy theories, Jones became obsessed in 1995 with the Y2K computer crash, and especially with the potential lack of antibiotics in the coming apocalypse. His immune system, he decided, had better get ready. So he began to distill a heavy metal moonshine in his backyard by dipping silver wires attached to 9-volt batteries into tubs of water. A method not even hardcore silver evangelists recommend, since electric currents that strong dissolve far too many silver ions in the bath. Jones drank his stash faithfully for 4.5 years, right until Y2K fizzled out in January 2000. Despite that dud, and despite being gawked at during his serial Senate campaigns, Jones remains unrepentant. He certainly wasn't running for office to wake up the Food and Drug Administration, which in good libertarian fashion intervenes with elemental cures only when they cause acute harm or make promises they cannot possibly keep. A year after losing the 2002 election, Jones told a national magazine, "It's my fault that I overdosed on silver, but I still believe it's the best antibiotic in the world. If there were a biological attack on America, or if I came down with any type of disease, I'd immediately take it again. Being alive is more important than turning purple." Stan Jones' advice notwithstanding, the best modern medicines are not isolated elements, but complex compounds. Nevertheless, in the history of modern drugs, a few unexpected elements have played an outsized role. This history largely concerns lesser-known heroic scientists such as Gerhard Domach, but it starts with Louis Pasteur and a peculiar discovery he made about a property of biomolecules called handedness, which gets at the very essence of living matter. Odds are you're right-handed, but really, you're not. You're left-handed. Every amino acid in every protein in your body has a left-handed twist to it. In fact, virtually every protein in every life form that has ever existed is exclusively left-handed. If astrobiologists ever find a microbe on a meteor or moon of Jupiter, almost the first thing they'll test is the handedness of its proteins. If the proteins are left-handed, the microbe is possibly earthly contamination. If they're right-handed, it's certainly alien life. Pasteur noticed this handedness because he began his career studying modest fragments of life as a chemist. In 1849, at age 26, he was asked by a winery to investigate tartaric acid, a harmless waste product of wine production. Grape seeds and yeast carcasses decompose into tartaric acid and collect as crystals in the dregs of wine kegs. Yeast-borne tartaric acid also has a curious property. Dissolve it in water and shine a vertical slit of light through the solution, and the beam will twist clockwise away from the vertical. It's like rotating a dial. Industrial, human-made tartaric acid does nothing like that. A vertical beam emerges true and upright. Pasteur wanted to figure out why. He determined that it had nothing to do with the chemistry of the two types of tartaric acid. They behaved identically in reactions, and the elemental composition of both was the same. Only when he examined the crystals with a magnifying glass did he notice any difference. The tartaric acid crystals from yeast all twisted in one direction, like tiny, severed left-handed fists. The industrial tartaric acid twisted both ways, a mixture of left and right-handed fists. Intrigued, Pasteur began the unimaginably tedious job of separating the salt-sized grains into a lefty pile and a righty pile with tweezers. He then dissolved each pile in water and tested more beams of light. Just as he suspected, the yeast-like crystals rotated light clockwise, while the mirror image crystals rotated light counterclockwise, and exactly the same number of degrees. Pasteur mentioned these results to his mentor, Jean-Baptiste Biot, who had first discovered that some compounds could twist light. The old man demanded that Pasteur show him, then nearly broke down. He was so deeply moved at the elegance of the experiment. In essence, Pasteur had shown that there are two identical but mirror-image types of tartaric acid. More important, Pasteur later expanded this idea to show that life has a strong bias for molecules of only one-handedness, or chirality. Author's note: it's a bit of a stretcher to claim that people are exclusively left-handed on a molecular level. Even though all of our proteins are indeed left-handed, all of our carbohydrates, as well as our DNA, have a right-handed twist. Regardless, Pasteur's main point remains. In different contexts, our bodies expect and can only process molecules of a specific handedness. Our cells would not be able to translate left-handed DNA, and if we were fed left-handed sugars, our bodies would starve. Pasteur later admitted he'd been a little lucky with this brilliant work. Tartaric acid, unlike most molecules, is easy to see as chiral. In addition, although no one could have anticipated a link between chirality and rotating light, Pasteur had Biot to guide him through the optical rotation experiments. Most serendipitously, the weather cooperated. When preparing the man-made tartaric acid, Pasteur had cooled it on a windowsill. The acid separates into left and right-handed crystals only below 79 degrees Fahrenheit, and had it been warmer that season, he never would have discovered handedness. Still, Pasteur knew that luck explained just part of his success. As he himself declared, chance favors only the prepared mind. Pasteur was skilled enough for this luck to persist throughout his life. Though not the first to do so, he performed an ingenious experiment on meat broth in sterile flasks and proved definitely that air contains no vitalizing element, no spirit that can summon life from dead matter. Life is built solely, if mysteriously, from the elements on the periodic table. Pasteur also developed pasteurization, a process that heats milk to kill infectious diseases. And, most famously at the time, he saved a young boy's life with his rabies vaccine. For the latter deed, he became a national hero, and he parlayed that fame into the clout he needed to open an eponymous institute outside Paris to further his revolutionary germ theory of disease. Not quite coincidentally, it was at the Pasteur Institute in the 1930s that a few vengeful, vindictive scientists figured out how the first laboratory-made pharmaceuticals worked, and in doing so hung yet another millstone around the neck of Pasteur's intellectual descendant, the great microbiologist of his era, Gerhard Domach. In early December 1935, Domach's daughter Hildegard tripped down the staircase of the family home in Wuppertal, Germany, while holding a sewing needle. The needle punctured her hand, eyelet first, and snapped off inside her. A doctor extracted the shard, but days later Hildegard was languishing, suffering from a high fever and a brutal streptococcal infection all up and down her arm. As she grew worse, Domac himself languished and suffered, because death was a frighteningly common outcome for such infections. Once the bacteria began multiplying, no known drug could check their greed. Except there was one drug, or rather one possible drug. It was really a red industrial dye that Domac had been quietly testing in his lab. On December 20th, 1932, he had injected a litter of mice with 10 times the lethal dose of streptococcal bacteria. He had done the same with another litter. He'd also injected the second litter with that industrial dye, Prontosil, 90 minutes later. On Christmas Eve, Domac, until that day an insignificant chemist, stole back into his lab to peek. Every mouse in the second litter was alive. Every mouse in the first had died. That wasn't the only fact confronting Domac as he kept vigil over Hildegard. Prontosil, a ringed organic molecule that a little unusually contains a sulfur atom, had unpredictable properties. Germans at the time believed, a little oddly, that dyes killed germs by turning the germs' vital organs the wrong color. But Prontosil, though lethal to microbes inside mice, had no effect on bacteria in test tubes. They swam around happily in the red wash. No one knew why, and because of that ignorance, numerous European doctors had attacked German chemotherapy, dismissing it as inferior to surgery in treating infection. Even Domac didn't quite believe in his drug. Between the mouse experiment in 1932 and Hildegard's accident, tentative clinical trials in humans had gone well, but with occasional serious side effects. Not to mention that it caused people to flush bright red, like lobsters. Although he was willing to risk the possible deaths of patients in clinical trials for the greater good, risking his daughter was another matter. In this dilemma, Domac found himself in the same situation that Pasteur had 50 years before, when a young mother had brought her son so mangled by a rabid dog he could barely walk to Pasteur in France. Pasteur treated the boy with a rabies vaccine tested only on animals, and the boy lived. Author's note: Joseph Meister, the little boy Pasteur saved from rabies, ended up becoming the groundskeeper for the Pasteur Institute. Tragically, poignantly, he was still groundskeeper in 1940 when German soldiers overran France. When one officer demanded that Meister, the man with the keys, open up Pasteur's crypt so that he, the officer, could view Pasteur's bones, Meister committed suicide rather than be complicit with this act. Pasteur wasn't a licensed doctor, and he administered the vaccine despite the threat of criminal prosecution if it failed. If Domac failed, he would have the additional burden of having killed a family member. Yet as Hildegard sank further, he likely could not rid his memory of the 2 cages of mice that Christmas Eve, one teeming with busy rodents, the other still. When Hildegard's doctor announced he would have to amputate her arm, Domac laid aside his caution. Violating pretty much every research protocol you could draw up, he sneaked some doses of the experimental drug from his lab and began injecting her with the blood-colored serum. At first, Hildegard worsened. Her fever alternately spiked and crashed over the next couple of weeks. Suddenly, exactly 3 years after her father's mouse experiment, Hildegard stabilized. She would live, with both arms intact. Though euphoric, Domac held back mentioning his clandestine experiment to his colleagues, so as not to bias the clinical trials. But his colleagues didn't need to hear about Hildegard to know that Domac had found a blockbuster, the first genuine antibacterial drug. It's hard to overstate what a revelation this drug was. The world in Domac's day was modern in many ways. People had quick cross-continental transportation via trains and quick international communication via the telegraph. What they didn't have was much hope of surviving even common infections. With Prontosil, plagues that had ravaged human beings since history began seemed conquerable and might even be eradicated. The only remaining question was how Prontosil worked. Not to break my authorial distance, but the following explanation must be chaperoned with an apology. After expounding on the utility of the octet rule, I hate telling you that there are exceptions, and that Prontosil succeeds as a drug largely because it violates this rule. Specifically, if surrounded by stronger-willed elements, sulfur will farm out all 6 of its outer shell electrons and expand its octet into a dozenet. In Prontosil's case, the sulfur shares 1 electron with a benzene ring of carbon atoms, 1 with a short nitrogen chain, and 2 each with 2 greedy oxygen atoms. That's 6 bonds with 12 electrons. A lot to juggle. And no element but sulfur could pull it off. Sulfur lies in the periodic table's 3rd row, so it's large enough to take on more than 8 electrons and bring all those important parts together. Yet it's only in the 3rd row, and therefore small enough to let everything fit around it in the proper 3-dimensional arrangement. Domac, primarily a bacteriologist, was ignorant of all that chemistry, and he eventually decided to publish his results so other scientists could help him figure out how Prontosil works. But there were tricky business issues to consider. The chemical cartel Domac worked for, IG Farber Industry, IGF, the company that later manufactured Fritz Haber's Zyklon B, already sold Prontosil as a dye, but it filed for a patent extension on Prontosil as a medicine immediately after Christmas in 1932. And with clinical proof that the drug worked well in humans, IGF was fervid about maintaining its intellectual property rights. When Domac pushed to publish his results, the company forced him to hold back until the medicinal patent on Prontosil came through, a delay that earned Domac and IGF criticism, since people died while lawyers quibbled. Then IGF made Domac publish in an obscure German-only periodical to prevent other firms from finding out about Prontosil. Despite the precaution, and despite Prontosil's revolutionary promise, the drug flopped when it hit the market. Foreign doctors continued to harangue about it, and many simply didn't believe it would work. Not until the drug saved the life of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jr., who was struck by a severe strep throat in 1936 and earned a headline in the New York Times, did Prontosil and its lone sulfur atom win any respect. Suddenly, Domac might as well have been an alchemist for all the money IGF stood to make, and any ignorance about how Prontosil worked seemed trifling. Who cared when sales figures jumped 5-fold in 1936, then 5-fold more the next year? Meanwhile, the scientists at the Pasteur Institute in France had dug up Domac's obscure journal article. In a froth that was equal parts anti-intellectual property because they hated how patents hindered basic research, and anti-Teuton because they hated Germans, the Frenchmen immediately set about busting the IGF patent. Never underestimate spite as a motivator for genius. Prontosil worked as well as advertised on bacteria, but the Pasteur scientists noticed some odd things when they traced its course through the body. First, it wasn't Prontosil that fought off bacteria, but a derivative of it, sulfonamide, which mammal cells produce by splitting Prontosil in 2. This explained instantly why bacteria in test tubes had not been affected. No mammal cells had biologically activated the Prontosil by cleaving it. Second, sulfonamide, with its central sulfur atoms and hexapus of side chains, disrupts the production of folic acid, a nutrient all cells use to replicate DNA and reproduce. Mammals get folic acid from their diets, which means sulfonamide doesn't hobble their cells. But bacteria have to manufacture their own folic acid, or they can't undergo mitosis and spread. In effect, then, the Frenchmen proved that Domac had discovered not a bacteria killer, but bacteria birth control. This breakdown of Prontosil was stunning news, and not just medically stunning. The important bit of Prontosil, sulfonamide, had been invented years before. It had even been patented in 1909 by IG Farber Industry, but had languished because the company had tested it only as a dye. Author's note: The company Domak worked for, IG Farber Industry, IGF, would later become notorious around the world for manufacturing the insecticide Zyklon B, which the Nazis used to gas concentration camp prisoners. See Chapter 5. The company was broken up shortly after World War II, and many of its directors faced war crimes charges at Nuremberg, United States versus Karl Crouch et al., for enabling the Nazi government in its aggressive war and mistreating prisoners and captured soldiers. IGF's descendants today include Bayer and BASF. By the mid-1930s, the patent had expired. The Pasteur Institute scientists published their results with undisguised glee, giving everyone in the world a license to circumvent the Prontosil patent. Domak and IGF, of course, protested that Prontosil, not sulfonamide, was the crucial component. But as evidence accumulated against them, they dropped their claims. The company lost millions in product investment and probably hundreds of millions in profits as competitors swept in and synthesized other sulfa drugs. Despite Domak's professional frustration, his peers understood what he'd done, and they rewarded Pasteur's heir with the 1939 Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology, just 7 years after the Christmas mice experiment. But if anything, the Nobel made Domak's life worse. Hitler hated the Nobel Committee for awarding the 1935 Peace Prize to an anti-Nazi journalist and pacifist, and Die Führer had made it basically illegal for any German to win a Nobel Prize. As such, the Gestapo arrested and brutalized Domak for his crime. When World War II broke out, Domak redeemed himself a little by convincing the Nazis, they refused to believe at first, that his drugs could save soldiers suffering from gangrene. But the Allies had sulfa drugs by then, too, and it couldn't have increased Domak's popularity when his drugs saved Winston Churchill in 1942, a man bent on destroying Germany. Perhaps even worse, the drug Domak had trusted to save his daughter's life had become a dangerous fad. People demanded sulfonamide for every sore throat and sniffle and soon saw it as some sort of elixir. Their hopes became a nasty joke when quick buck salesmen in the United States took advantage of this mania by peddling sulfas sweetened with antifreeze. Hundreds died within weeks. Further proof that when it comes to panaceas, the credulity of human beings is boundless. Antibiotics were the culmination of Pasteur's discoveries about germs. But not all diseases are germ-based. Many have roots in chemical or hormonal troubles. And modern medicine began to address that second class of diseases only after embracing Pasteur's other great insight into biology, chirality. Not long after offering his opinion about chance and the prepared mind, Pasteur said something else that, if not as pithy, stirs a deeper sense of wonder, because it gets at something truly mysterious. What makes life live? After determining that life has a bias toward handedness on a deep level, Pasteur suggested that chirality was the sole, well-marked line of demarcation that at the present can be drawn between the chemistry of dead matter and the chemistry of living matter. If you've ever wondered what defines life, chemically, there's your answer. Author's note: nevertheless, the universe seems to be chiral on other levels too, from the subatomic to the supergalactic. The radioactive beta decay of cobalt-60 is an asymmetric process, and cosmologists have seen preliminary evidence that galaxies tend to rotate in counterclockwise spiral arms above our northern galactic pole, and in clockwise spirals beneath Antarctica. Pasteur's statement guided biochemistry for a century, during which doctors made incredible progress in understanding diseases. At the same time, the insight implied that curing diseases, the real prize, would require chiral hormones and chiral biochemicals, and scientists realized that Pasteur's dictum, however perceptive and helpful, subtly highlighted their own ignorance. That is, in pointing out the gulf between the dead chemistry that scientists could do in the lab and the living cellular chemistry that supported life, Pasteur simultaneously pointed out there was no easy way to cross it. that didn't stop people from trying. Some scientists obtained chiral chemicals by distilling essences and hormones from animals, but in the end that proved too arduous. In the 1920s, two Chicago chemists had to puree several thousand pounds of bull testicles from a stockyard to get a few ounces of the first pure testosterone. The other possible approach was to ignore Pasteur's distinction and manufacture both right-handed and left-handed versions of biochemicals. This was actually fairly easy to do, because statistically, reactions that produce handed molecules are equally likely to form righties and lefties. The problem with this approach is that mirror-image molecules have different properties inside the body. The zesty odor of lemons and oranges derives from the same basic molecules, one right-handed and one left-handed. Wrong-handed molecules can even destroy left-handed biology. A German drug company in the 1950s began marketing a remedy for morning sickness in pregnant women, but the benign, curative form of the active ingredient was mixed in with the wrong-handed form because scientists couldn't separate them. The freakish birth defects that followed, especially children born without legs or arms, their hands and feet stitched like turtle flippers to their trunks, made thalidomide the most notorious pharmaceutical of the 20th century. Author's note: a few scientists recently reconstructed why thalidomide's devastating effects slipped through clinical trials. For nitty-gritty molecular reasons, thalidomide doesn't cause birth defects in litters of mice, and the German company that produced thalidomide, Grunenthal, did not follow up mouse trials with careful human trials. The drug was never approved for pregnant women in the United States because the head of the Food and Drug Administration, Francis Oldham Kelsey, refused to bow to lobbying pressure to push it through. In one of those curious twists of history, thalidomide is now making a comeback to treat diseases such as leprosy, where it's remarkably effective. It's also a good anti-cancer agent because it limits the growth of tumors by preventing new blood vessels from forming, which is also why it caused such awful birth defects, since embryos' limbs couldn't get the nutrients they needed to grow. Thalidomide still has a long road back to respectability. Most governments have strict protocols in place to make sure doctors do not give the drug to women of childbearing age on the off chance that they might become pregnant. As the thalidomide disaster unfolded, the prospects of chiral drugs seemed dimmer than ever. But at the same time people were publicly mourning thalidomide babies, a St. Louis chemist named William Knowles began playing around with an unlikely elemental hero, rhodium, in a private research lab at Monsanto, an agricultural company. Knowles quietly circumvented Pasteur and proved that dead matter, if you were clever about it, could indeed invigorate living matter. Knowles had a flat, two-dimensional molecule he wanted to inflate into 3 dimensions, because the left-handed version of the 3D molecule had shown promising effects on brain diseases such as Parkinson's. The sticking point was getting the proper handedness. Notice that 2D objects cannot be chiral. After all, a flat cardboard cutout of your right hand can be flipped over to make a left hand. Handedness emerges only with the z-axis. But inanimate chemicals in a reaction don't know how to make one hand or the other. They make both, unless they're tricked. Author's note: William Knowles unfolded the molecule by breaking a double bond. When carbon forms double bonds, it has only 3 arms coming out of it, 2 single bonds and a double. There are still 8 electrons, but they are shared over 3 bonds. Carbon atoms with double bonds usually form triangular molecules, since a tri-cornered arrangement keeps its electrons as far apart as possible, 120 degrees. When the double bond breaks, carbon's 3 arms become 4. In that case, the way to keep electrons as far apart as possible is not with a planar square, but with a 3-dimensional tetrahedron. The vertices in a square are 90 degrees apart. In a tetrahedron, they're 109.5 degrees apart. But the extra arm can sprout above or below the molecule, which will in turn give the molecule either left or right-handedness. Knowles' trick was a rhodium catalyst. Catalysts speed up chemical reactions to degrees that are hard to comprehend in our pokey, everyday human world. Some catalysts improve reaction rates by millions, billions, or even trillions of times. Rhodium works pretty fast, and Knowles found that one rhodium atom could inflate innumerably many of his 2D molecules. So he affixed the rhodium to the center of an already chiral compound, creating a chiral catalyst. The clever part was that both the chiral catalyst with the rhodium atom and the target 2D molecule were sprawling and bulky. So when they approached each other to react, they did so like two obese animals trying to have sex. That is, the chiral compound could poke its rhodium atom into the 2D molecule only from one position. And from that position, with arms and belly flab in the way, the 2D molecule could unfold into a 3D molecule in only one dimension. That limited maneuverability during coitus, coupled with rhodium's catalytic ability to fast-forward reactions, meant that Knowles could get away with doing only a bit of the hard work, making a chiral rhodium catalyst, and still reap bushels of correctly handed molecules. The year was 1968, and modern drug synthesis began at that moment. A moment later honored with a Nobel Prize in Chemistry for Knowles in 2001. Incidentally, the drug that rhodium churned out for Knowles is levo-dihydroxyphenylalanine, or L-DOPA, a compound since made famous in Oliver Sacks' book, Awakenings. The book documents how L-DOPA shook awake 80 patients who developed extreme Parkinson's disease after contracting sleeping sickness, encephalitis lethargica, in the 1920s. All 80 were institutionalized, and many had spent 4 decades in a neurological haze, a few in continuous catatonia. Sacks describes them as totally lacking energy, impetus, initiative, motive, appetite, affect, or desire, as insubstantial as ghosts and as passive as zombies, extinct volcanoes. In 1967, a doctor had had great success in treating Parkinson's patients with L-DOPA, a precursor of the brain chemical dopamine. Like Domac's Prontosil, L-DOPA must be biologically activated in the body. But the right and left-handed forms of the molecule were knotty to separate, and the drug cost upwards of $5,000 per pound. Miraculously, though without being aware why, Sacks notes that towards the end of 1968, the cost of L-DOPA started a sharp decline. Freed by Knowles' breakthrough, Sacks began treating his catatonic patients in New York not long after, and, in the spring of 1969, in a way which no one could have imagined or foreseen, these extinct volcanoes erupted into life. The volcano metaphor is accurate, as the effects of the drug weren't wholly benign. Some people became hyperkinetic, with racing thoughts, and others began to hallucinate or gnaw on things like animals. But these forgotten people almost uniformly preferred the mania of L-DOPA to their former listlessness. Sacks recalls that their families and the hospital staff had long considered them effectively dead, and even some of the victims considered themselves so. Only the left-handed version of Knowles' drug revived them. Once again, Pasteur's dictum about the life-giving properties of proper-handed chemicals proved true.